Hello, my name is Myrlie Evers Williams, Chairman Emeritus of the NAACP and widow of slain civil rights leader Medgar Evers. For over 50 years, I have struggled to bring to light the work of my late husband and others from the civil rights movement of the 20th century. Names, places, and stories that may only be footnotes in the history books, but are nevertheless important to understanding our nation's history. When Farmers Insurance and ASALH, the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, told me about the Freedom's Song Project, I was eager to lend my support. Following the vision of its founder, the noted historian Dr. Carter G. Woodson, ASALH has worked for more than 90 years to bring African American history to life for students and educators everywhere. They are the founders of Black History Month. Likewise, for years, Farmers Insurance has been a strong advocate for teachers, lending its support to award-winning documentaries and educational programs including The American Promise, The Bronze Screen, and Going for Broke. The documentary you are about to see, Freedom's Song, 100 Years of African American Struggle and Triumph, relates 10 important stories from the 20th century, one pivotal event for each decade, that has either been omitted from textbooks or only marginally discussed. These stories are essential to understanding Black history and American history in the 20th century. The 10 stories were selected by a team of preeminent Black history scholars from Howard University in Washington, D.C. The documentary also includes brief introductions to 10 important figures in Black history from the last century. The segments called Someone You Should Know immediately follow each decade's episode. My late husband Medgar is one of those highlighted in the Someone You Should Know mini biographies. I encourage you to have your students research these important lives to learn more. Finally, an outstanding lesson plan for middle and high school students accompanies this DVD, developed by a curriculum design team headed by Dr. LaVon Neal at the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs. The lessons are easy to use and are a great addition to your American history curriculum. Through a generous grant from Farmers Insurance, both the Freedom's Song DVD and the lesson plans are provided free of charge to any educator who requests them. You can also find out about Farmers' other outstanding educational programs and the special discounts Farmers offers to educators in most states on their website at farmers.com. And now, it is my pleasure to invite you on a journey through 100 years of African American struggle and triumph as we give you Freedom's Song.
"1900, a new century begins. Hopes are high for the nation known for freedom. But for African Americans, the promise of freedom forged on the battlefields of the Civil War less than 40 years earlier was far from becoming a reality.
Jim Crow was taking effect throughout the nation, particularly in the South, and it was a very dark time, perhaps the darkest time in America's racial history. At the same time, though, African Americans were figuring out how to create institutions that would enable them to survive in this hostile environment. They were carving out areas of safe haven for themselves.
This is about the time where Rayford Logan, a famous historian from Howard University, called it the nadir of black life in America, the lowest point. This is a time that segregation is being legalized throughout the South. Blacks are being segregated in their public facilities, are losing the right to vote. Many of them are losing their land. It is a really bad time. And right before the turn of the 20th century marks the rise of a man named Booker T. Washington.
Booker T. Washington was a self-made man. He was born a slave. He taught himself how to read. He ended up going to Hampton Institute. He became determined to lift up his people, the Southern black people. He saw that the Southern whites were getting more and more agitated about race. He also saw that in the North, those sympathetic to the race issue were more concerned about uniting white America, North and South, and at long last healed those scars still left over from the Civil War. With this in mind, Booker T. Washington devised a plan.
He believed that in order for blacks to raise up, that they needed to basically consolidate themselves. They needed to learn how to become self-sufficient, because he didn't believe that at this particular time anyway, blacks and whites were going to be able to live together in an integrated kind of fashion, which some people had somewhat been arguing. Most people weren't. And white Southerners were proving themselves dead set against this.
In 1895, Booker T. Washington became the first president of Tuskegee Institute, which was a school designed to teach blacks about becoming economically self-sufficient. They taught blacks how to purchase a farm, how to work a farm, how to become skilled laborers. That same year, Booker T. Washington was invited to speak at Negro Day at the Atlanta Cotton Exposition, addressing a mixed crowd of blacks and whites. The speech became known to some as the Atlanta Compromise.
What he basically said there was that blacks need to focus their attention on becoming economically self-sufficient, learning a trade, learning how to use their hands and their minds to get ahead, to own their own piece of the world. That blacks should not endeavor to integrate or become politically active, because all that was going to do was cause agitation between the races.
Booker T. Washington's message fit the times well. The white community in both the North and the South embraced it, as did most of the black community.
When Booker T. Washington gave this address, they embraced him and said, that's a good plan. Most blacks didn't want to, quote unquote, integrate as we think of now, living in white neighborhoods, going to school with whites. They wanted an equal chance to have their own communities.
But for some African Americans, what Booker T. Washington was asking for was not enough. At the dawn of the new century, another black intellectual began to add his voice to freedom's song. He was the first black to receive a doctorate degree from Harvard. His name was W.E.B. Du Bois, and what he had to say struck a different tone than that of Booker T. Washington. With his schoolmate William Monroe Trotter, the first black Phi Beta Kappa at Harvard, Du Bois developed a plan to act as a counterforce to Booker T. Washington. Their plan called for full equality in America.
They would not settle for anything less than a right that was given to any American. So somebody who was born in America, whose family was raised in America, whose grandfather was most likely born in America. They wanted every single right that the Constitution declared that a native-born American deserved, that the Bill of Rights suggested that every single American should have.
In 1905, Du Bois and Trotter met with 59 other like-minded black men in Buffalo, New York. The historic meeting would later be dubbed the Niagara Movement. They had to cross the border into Canada to meet because they could not find facilities in Buffalo. Even in this northern city, African Americans were not allowed to congregate in white establishments. So they crossed the border into another country to make a declaration for American rights. And here, the Niagara Movement began with a declaration of principles.
These are the demands. And I use that term, demand, because they use that term in a document in 1905. They demanded the right to vote. They demanded the right for access to health care. They demanded the right to go to school at high quality schools. They demanded the right to be judged by a jury of their peers. These are all rights that are every day being denied Black Americans, that the average person could have afforded at this time that was not Black. They're saying this, we demand these things, which is a tone incredibly different than what Booker T. Washington was saying 10 years earlier.
The Niagara movement comes to life for me, and I relate to it because it's at a time in African American history and in American history that America is at a place where it can make some decisions. It's right not long after the turn of the century, in the 20th century, and Americans have some choices to make about where they're going to go with race relations. And the people who organized the Niagara movement, like Du Bois and Trotter, understand this even more than white America does. And what they do is they see America in trauma, really. We are at a place where there are riots everywhere, that Blacks are being lynched throughout the South, men and women, and they have had enough of it, but they want to move in a more peaceful way. They don't want to, start a revolution, so to speak, but they do want America, and especially Blacks in America, to understand that we are at a point in history we're going to have to draw the line. And so what the Niagara movement does is to say, we have to speak up with our voices loud to say, enough is enough, America.
The next year, the Niagara movement chose to meet in Harpers Ferry, West Virginia, to commemorate the 100th birthday of abolitionist John Brown, who had said that the only way the South would relent of its slavery tradition was through the edge of the sword, predicting that there would be a civil war years before it happened. This time, the Niagara movement opened its doors to not just Black men, but Black women and white men and women. The movement continued to meet over the next 3 years, but without the support of the most famous and powerful African American of the day, Booker T. Washington, the Niagara movement began to break down. By 1909, W.E.B. Du Bois was ready to form his own organization, destined to become a major force in the 20th century, the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. But it was the Niagara movement that set the tone for a century of struggle and sounded the first chords of freedom's song.
Most Americans may have never heard of the Niagara movement, but its spirit has influenced every single Black movement throughout the 20th century.
I don't think the importance of the Niagara movement can be overstated in any way. One, it certainly reflects the coming together of Black people to seek solutions to their own problems. It also reflects that both men and women are involved in the leadership of attempting to address these issues, and as well that this was an interracial, if not multiracial, effort, that both Blacks and whites, men and women, were coming together to address these issues.
The Niagara movement speaks to me as a Black American, as a woman, as an American. In fact, it speaks to me as a global citizen, understanding that it takes courage, it takes understanding and knowledge, but most of all, it takes the need to persevere, to keep doing what is right and what is just. This movement was really the beginnings of an organized social justice movement that started in 1905 and has not ended in America.
100 years after the Niagara movement met in 1905, the Association for the Study of African American Life and History held their annual conference in Buffalo, New York, to commemorate the event. This time, they didn't have to cross over into another country. They walked right into the front door of the Buffalo Hyatt Regency Hotel. During the period prior to World War I, racial prejudice ran rampant. Jim Crow laws were still in place, and distrust of African Americans was high. World War I, however, offered a unique opportunity to the African American community. Many black leaders believed that if African Americans wanted further equality on American soil, they would need to prove their loyalty on the battlefields of Europe. They would need to work, fight, and die for their country. As the United States entered World War I, even W.E.B. Du Bois, whose Niagara movement a decade earlier had demanded equality for African Americans, said, "While the war lasts, we should forget our special grievances and close our ranks shoulder to shoulder with our white fellow citizens and allied nations that are fighting for democracy."
One has to realize that since the American Revolution, Black Americans have fought in every single major military campaign that America has fought. And they fought in these campaigns because they believed that in order to become American citizens, in order to be respected by the political power base of America and everyday Americans, in many ways, many of them believed that they had to prove themselves worthy of this American citizenship.
African American soldiers were housed in inadequate quarters. In some cases, black soldiers actually froze to death. They were issued worn-out uniforms and were poorly trained, often not even being issued weapons to be trained with for fear they would use the weapons against whites.
My grandfather's feelings were mixed about fighting in World War I. On the one hand, he was very proud of the fact that he wore the uniform and he defended America, and it proved his manhood and his rights to citizenship. On the other hand, he remained bitter about the segregation and the discrimination that black troops faced during World War I.
The important aspect of the First World War is that it more widely exposed Black Americans to the international community and gave them an opportunity to see how the world was outside of the United States. The disappointment is that those same black soldiers fighting for democracy and the rights of Americans that they had been denied, were even denied the right to fight fully under the flag of their own nation, and often found themselves fighting alongside our allies simply because of the racism and segregation that has existed in our society.
Over in Europe, America's highest-ranking official, General John J. Pershing, made an effort to follow through with the racist policies of the day. In 1918, Pershing wrote an order to the French commanders entitled Secret Information Concerning the Black American Troops. This order directed the French officers in command of the Black American troops to treat these black soldiers differently than their white counterparts. Pershing's order read, "Although a citizen of the United States, the black man is regarded by the white American as an inferior being. The black is constantly being censored for his want of intelligence and discretion, his lack of civic and professional conscience, and for his tendency toward undue familiarity. The vices of the Negro are a constant menace to the American, who has to repress them sternly." The directive went on to outline the Jim Crow laws of segregation as established in the United States, demanding that the French officers honor those laws. In spite of General Pershing's order, the African Americans who made it to the European theater experienced a different world when they arrived in France. The French people welcomed the American soldiers as liberators, all of them, black and white. The black soldiers were invited into homes and churches, as well as places of entertainment. This treatment of African Americans was quite different from the Jim Crow laws and institutionalized racism these same black soldiers faced at home.
World War I also created a similar situation that would happen in World War II, where black men would go halfway across the world to fight for freedom and see sights that they had never dreamed of seeing. These were people who at once were on the plantation, or a generation or two removed from slavery themselves, going over to Europe to fight and getting some respect from whites in Europe at this time.
The white American officers with African American soldiers under their command often viewed them as inadequate for combat. As a result, many African American soldiers were assigned to manual labor and cooking. But African Americans who served under French officers were given the chance to prove themselves in battle. And prove themselves they did. Some of the most heroic, legendary units of the war were the African American divisions, distinguishing themselves in battle over and over again. New York's 369th National Guard Regiment was the most decorated American unit of the war, white or black, and claimed the longest time on the front line of any American unit, 191 days. The Germans would later refer to them as the Hellfighters. Despite their bravery and heroics, African Americans were virtually ignored by the American military in terms of recognition. Officers and soldiers who had been awarded high honors by the French, including the Croix de Guerre and Legion of Honor, were often given no military honor by the Americans. The desire to keep blacks in their place was so strong that some were even stripped of their French-bestowed honors by the American military command. The most striking insult came during the Allies' victory parade in Paris, when the most decorated unit in the war, New York's 369th, was denied permission to march. Over 250,000 black men had fought courageously to help keep Europe free, and while there, they had experienced a sense of freedom and pride they had not known at home. This new spirit returned with them to America, where they now faced a new battle for freedom.
And they're saying, I will not bow my head. I've worn the uniform of my country. I will not bow my head in the street of my birth now. And they're standing tall. They're standing tall in southern streets. They're standing tall in back countries. And a lot of white Southerners do not like this. This is too much pride for these Negroes to have. So there was many instances all throughout the country, North and South, of huge race riots in the year after World War I because blacks had to be reminded of their place.
The First World War is an important point in our history because I believe thereafter we find that America and the world are both quite different, and that black Americans never again return to any kind of servile position within our nation, and that in a very real sense, while the struggle for civil rights had been continuous, that this set the stage for a new phase of the civil rights struggle. And we find that this extends throughout the remainder of the 20th century.
And so these brave warriors, these hell fighters, returned home after being respected and honored by white Europeans, only to discover their battle had just begun. In many ways, the roots of the civil rights movement of the 50s and black pride of the 60s had its beginnings in the trenches of Europe during World War I. Freedom song had been heard loud and clear in Europe by African American soldiers, and now it was America's turn to face the music. With the conclusion of World War I, the United States had become a superpower, a stunning symbol of freedom that shone as a beacon of democracy for the whole world to emulate. But at home, some citizens still struggled for those basic rights outlined in America's own Constitution. For many African Americans, Freedom Song was still just a faint whisper. 25 years earlier, in 1895, Booker T. Washington had advocated that the best way African Americans could improve their lot was not through integration, but rather to band together to create strong, self-sufficient African American neighborhoods of their own. By 1921, one of the most impressive examples of this was the black district of Tulsa, Oklahoma called Greenwood. In Greenwood, African Americans had created a thriving metropolitan community, complete with black doctors, lawyers, bankers, and other professionals. Greenwood was the pride of black America, and to some white Tulsa residents, a source of embarrassment and envy.
You look back to Tulsa, where in the 1920s, African Americans had accomplished a tremendous amount in terms of entrepreneurship, other types of businesses, professions, medicine, dentistry. This was a viable and thriving, predominantly black-owned business district in a major city in the United States. And it presented a threat.
The Tulsa community of Oklahoma is a fairly affluent black community. And you had this portion where black Americans are doing very well. And there are segments of the white population who did not like this.
As the success of Tulsa's black district grew, so did the underlying resentment among the white community. This resentment seethed under the surface, waiting for the right event to set the wheels of rage into motion. That moment came in late spring 1921.
And so in February 1921, my mother and father decided that he should go to Tulsa, where he could perhaps make a living practicing law. My father went on to Tulsa, and he would bring us there at the end of the school term. So we were all packed and ready to go. And he was to come for us and escort us to Tulsa. We were waiting for him to come, and he didn't come. And he didn't come. And he didn't come.
On May 30th, 1921, Dick Rowland, a 19-year-old black shoeshine man, stepped into the elevator operated by a white 17-year-old girl named Sarah Page. As Rowland entered the elevator, he tripped over Page's shoe. In an attempt to regain his balance, he reached out and grabbed for her arm. Surprised, Page let out a scream that alerted nearby businessmen. A frightened Rowland ran from the elevator. This innocent event was the spark that ignited the most gruesome race riot in American history.
When modern people think of a race riot, they think of the LA riots or the Cincinnati riots that happened, where beleaguered black classes would take out in the street and start looting and burning. What race riots for most of the 20th century was white thugs going into black communities and indiscriminately clubbing black people, killing black people.
Rowland was quickly arrested and taken to the courthouse for a trial. A crowd of over 2,000 whites surrounded the courthouse, demanding that he be handed over to them for lynching. A small contingent of about 25 African American men arrived at the courthouse to offer their assistance to the sheriff. A scuffle ensued. A shot was fired. And the angry white mob turned their attention away from lynching Dick Rowland to killing any and all African Americans they could find and destroying the Greenwood district.
They had commandeered planes in that city and dropped bombs on what they called the Black Wall Street there in a place called Tulsa, Oklahoma. This whole idea that because people made money, that they called it a Black Wall Street, and they also dropped bombs in particular in that particular place. And about 70 people or more were killed.
My father said that he saw the bombs being dropped from planes over the black section of the town. It was not very long after World War I, and there was this sort of use of aircraft to invade the areas of town that otherwise might not be reached.
After the bombs, an estimated 10,000 white rioters descended upon Greenwood. The armed whites broke into the black homes and businesses, forcing the occupants out into the street, where they were led away at gunpoint to one of the growing number of internment centers. Anyone who resisted was shot. Next, the whites looted the homes and businesses, pocketing small items and hauling away larger items on foot or by car or truck. Finally, the white rioters set the homes and other buildings on fire, using torches and oil-soaked rags. When the Tulsa Fire Department showed up to douse the flames, they were turned away at gunpoint by the angry mob. House by house, block by block, the wall of flame crept northward, engulfing the city's black neighborhoods.
The city had been allegedly involved in the riot in that they had deputized the state troopers and others and had made it possible for them to come and join in the melee against the blacks in Tulsa. It was the city, though, that had deputized citizens of the city and placed guns and so forth in their hands and made it possible for them to invade the black section of town, to loot the houses, and to burn them down.
What ultimately happens with the Tulsa race riots, whites go into Tulsa, Oklahoma, the black community, and just start indiscriminately attacking blacks at this community. They're using rioting to remind blacks that they have a place. And to leave that place is unadvisable under penalty of death at any time. And there is nothing to defend you. No white people are going to be tried for the murder of a black person.
When I think of Tulsa, I think of it as being the most graphic illustration of the violence against black people during the 1920s, and also connected to the fact that African American soldiers were returning from World War I, and there were people who did not like to see black men in uniforms and did not want to see African Americans progress and move out of their place. And so Tulsa then became a symbol to the white community that blacks were moving out of their place. And that's why they had to be destroyed.
In the end, 13 whites and an estimated 300 blacks had been killed. Many were buried in mass graves. The total destruction of Greenwood became apparent as the black Tulsans were released from their imprisonment and returned to their homes and businesses burned to the ground. Nearly 10,000 Tulsans, almost the entire black community, was now homeless. Despite the heroic efforts of the Red Cross, thousands of them spent the winter of 1921 living in tents.
And my mother, in reading the paper, discovered that there had been a race riot in Tulsa and that there were many casualties. But she still hadn't heard from him and did not know whether he was in the riot, and if he was, whether he was living or dead. She just didn't know. And so we had several more days of anxiety before we finally got a note from my father. He had been detained during the entire riot, put in a place of detention, the convention hall, and when he got out of there, the entire black section of Tulsa had been leveled to the ground. And the place that he got for us to live in was no longer in existence at all. It was just ashes, as indeed his office was, as everything was, ashes.
Most white Tulsans in 1921 neither took part in nor did they condone the lawless actions of the vocal minority. Still, not a single arrest or charge was ever filed against the Tulsa population that did take part in the riot. And the first commission convened a few years later by the state of Oklahoma to investigate the causes of the 1921 Tulsa riot put the blame solely on Tulsa's black community. It took 8 decades for the true story to be told, when in 1997, Oklahoma Governor Frank Keating reopened the commission to examine what really happened and why.
It all started because of an incident, alleged incident, on an elevator of all places, where a young white girl accused a young black man of assaulting her, attempted assault. That case had already been tried and he'd been acquitted, and then he was retried though after the riot, and he was acquitted again. There was no evidence against him. But the loss of property and of lives, several hundred people were killed, and most of the area where African Americans lived was leveled to the ground, absolutely leveled to the ground.
In 1921, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, Freedom Song had struck a dissident chord. But from the ashes of Tulsa's Black Wall Street, the dream of freedom would rise again. In the coming decades, Freedom Song would be heard in Tulsa, and indeed, everywhere throughout America. October 1929, the stock market crashed, and an era began that would span the next decade, a period that became known as the Great Depression. Banks collapsed. Businesses went bankrupt. Unemployment in the United States skyrocketed to more than 12 million, or about 1/4 of the workforce. Nearly everyone suffered. But as much as Americans of European descent suffered, the African American experience was generally far worse. In the 1930s, unemployment rates for African Americans were double that of the total population. White workers who lost their employment sought jobs that had less pay and lower status, the jobs that were traditionally taken by African Americans.
The African Americans had it worse than anybody else because in the African American community they were at that time a lot of service jobs, porters, cooks, that sort of thing. And as the jobs disappeared for the whites got in there and said, we want you to get rid of these African Americans in the lower paying jobs, these traditional, what they call Negro jobs, so to make room for the white people to come in and take their jobs. So as the trickle-down effect of unemployment happened, the blacks got pushed out the bottom.
In addition to the economic woes, Jim Crow laws, a form of legal discrimination, were still in effect in southern states. These laws denied blacks the right to vote and to adequate schools for their children. The laws also created separate drinking fountains for blacks, segregated movie theaters and restaurants, and the seating of African Americans in the back of the bus. During the Depression, lynchings of African Americans were still commonplace, and membership in the Ku Klux Klan was on the rise.
The decade of the 30s opened my eyes, as they had never been opened before, to the question of race, racial degradation, and poverty, and all the rest of it. I graduated from high school in 1931, the pit of the Depression, and I went to Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee, on a scholarship, on a tuition scholarship. And I had not been in Nashville for a month before I was told in no uncertain terms where my place was. I was trying to come back from downtown Nashville on the streetcar, and I went into the transfer station. I only had a $20 bill, and I gave it to the man with apologies to the agent, the ticket agent, with apologies, saying that I was sorry, that was all the money I had, and he could, if he wanted, he could just give me the change in $1 bills if he wanted to. And he almost leaped through the windows. He told me that no nigger would ever tell him how to make change. And I stood there while he counted out $19.85 in nickels and dimes to me.
I went into a restaurant downtown Washington. I first came here. And I sat there and sat there. And, you know, I'm coming out of New York and Pennsylvania, and it didn't occur to me what was going on. And finally, the young woman came, and I told her what I wanted, and she said, I'm not supposed to serve you. So I said, why? So before I knew it, she did serve me. And then, before I could leave there, she just broke the dishes right in front of my face. I said, what are you doing? She says, we can't use these anymore.
Everybody suffered during the Great Depression. Everybody suffered. But African Americans suffered to an inordinate degree. They suffered most. The economic fabric of many of their communities and their lives were completely shattered. It led many African Americans to leave the South, to continue the Great Migration into northern communities and in the West.
The Great Depression has created a situation where it is forcing blacks and whites to leave their homes and just to be vagabonds, basically, riding the rails, going from community to community, just trying to find their next meal. Many people in America, both black and white, literally did not know where their next meal was going to come from.
At the height of the Depression, 250,000 teenagers were roaming America, hitching illegal rides on freight trains. An estimated 20% of these rail riders were African Americans. They left home for several reasons, some to find work to help support their families, others to relieve their families from the burden of feeding and clothing them. Many of the young wanderers had found the doors of their schools closed. Throughout America, only about 30% of school-age children attended schools in the 1930s. For African American students in the South, the percentages were even lower.
98% of the African American youths out there were looking for work and riding the rails and going from town to town, homeless. There are all these homeless kids. Now the white kids could go from town to town and not be noticed as an outsider. But if an African American kid went to another town, they knew right away it didn't belong, and so it was even harder for these guys to find work.
Young black teenagers venturing out across white America, homeless and hungry, set the stage for what became one of the most infamous court battles of the 20th century. On March 25, 1931, a posse of 50 men, armed with shotguns, rifles, and pistols, nervously lined both sides of the tracks near the Paint Rock Station on the Memphis line of the Southern Railroad. The men had gathered quickly, responding to urgent calls from the station master in Stevenson, 38 miles up the line. A group of white boys had told him they had been thrown off the train by a gang of black teenagers. The white boys wanted to press charges. The young black boys were to be arrested and brought back for trial. As the train pulled in, the posse rushed on board. Within 10 minutes, they had rounded up 9 raggedly dressed black boys and, unexpectedly, 2 white women in overalls, Victoria Price and Ruby Bates.
When these boys get into an altercation on a train with some whites, and the train keeps on going, they're stopped at the next stop, and they're caught on the train in a similar car where these white women who are of low reputation and who do not want to be arrested for prostitution, because essentially they are prostitutes. They accuse the black people who are on this train, these boys, of raping them.
The 9 arrested boys, soon to be called the Scottsboro Boys, were tied together with plow line, loaded on a flatbed truck, and taken to a jail in Scottsboro. The next day, the Scottsboro Boys were nearly lynched by a crowd of over 100 gathered around Scottsboro's jail. But the National Guard had been called in to ensure their safety, because very quickly, the Scottsboro Boys were becoming a national news story. The state of Alabama hoped to use the trial to demonstrate to the country that mob rule towards African Americans and lynchings in the South was a thing of the past.
The Scottsboro case is interesting because the fact that these 9 boys were even tried was awe-inspiring, because if the cameras were not on these 9 boys, these boys would have just seen the rope and that would have been done with it. The Scottsboro case gives the Alabama government an opportunity to prove that they can try, that Alabama is not just a state where the lynch mob rules. They can prove to the world that they handle their Negro problems with civility and justice, just like they handle any kind of problem. And they have a court case. It's a kangaroo court case, of course. The lawyer who is supposed to be defending is obviously not caring, going to sleep in court and things like that. So they are quickly convicted and sentenced basically to death, most of them anyway.
When the initial trials were over, 8 of the 9 Scottsboro boys had been convicted and sentenced to death. The 9th boy, 12-year-old Roy Wright, was the only one not sentenced to death. All 9 boys remained in prison as appeals were set in motion. Years passed, and after several appeals and more trials, the truth finally came out.
The Scottsboro case opened up to the world audience the idea that blacks in the American South, could not get justice through the court system. And it basically just rallied black America to say that there is injustice and we'll once again fight for freedom. But in that, it destroyed the lives of the 9 boys who were caught up in this storm.
No crime in American history, let alone a crime that never occurred, produced as many trials, convictions, reversals, and retrials as did the Scottsboro case. And although the case helped gain national attention to the injustice in the courts regarding African Americans, 9 innocent teenage boys would pay the price for the rest of their lives. 9 lives that were changed forever on a warm spring day in 1931. Their story is woven into the fabric of freedom song. Their legal struggle helped pave the way for future courtroom battles that, unlike theirs, would end in triumph. In 1940, after a decade of misery and hardship, America was still reeling from the Great Depression. But as a new decade began, another tragedy was looming in the black forests of Europe and the remote jungles of the Pacific. And by the end of 1941, America found itself in a Second World War. After the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, many African Americans rushed to the service of their country. They wanted to join the fight for freedom, even though their own civil rights were still being denied to them on the home front. Their efforts to enlist were sometimes derailed before they got off the ground.
They were yelling and screaming and begging for people to come and volunteer, so I volunteered. And I went down to the Naval Recruiting Office in Raleigh, North Carolina, and the young naval recruiter asked me what could I do. And I told him I could run an office. I was able to take shorthand. I have 3 gold medals in typing. And, oh yes, I have a PhD in history from Harvard. And he said, you have everything but color. And I said, well, I'm sorry, I thought that there was an emergency, but apparently there's not, so I bid you good day, and I left.
While many African Americans met resistance at the recruiting office, an opportunity presented itself in Alabama, the heart of the Jim Crow South. It would lead to fame and glory for nearly 1,000 African American men.
They called it the Tuskegee Experiment, where you not only had pilots learning how to fly aircraft, you had bombardiers, you had service people, you had technicians, anybody that would help that airplane fight for our country in war. You had the individuals there at the Tuskegee Experiment. We now know that in history really as the Tuskegee Airmen.
The Tuskegee Airmen were the first African Americans to serve in the U.S. Army Air Corps, the forerunner of today's Air Force. Composed of pilots, navigators, bombardiers, air traffic controllers, maintenance men, and support staff, they were part of the Tuskegee Experiment to train African Americans to fly and maintain combat aircraft in World War II.
It was a policy of the United States before the war started to bar African Americans from serving in the Air Corps as pilots. Sure, they can serve as cooks or stewards or even mechanics, but not to fly. And they changed that policy, so on July 19th, if my memory is correct, 1941, they formed the first unit at Tuskegee, Alabama.
The first unit was formed, but before the Tuskegee Experiment could get off the ground, it needed funds. Many in Washington believed African Americans lacked sufficient bravery, intelligence, and discipline to fly combat missions. One very influential person in Washington, however, disagreed and was determined to prove the naysayers wrong.
Eleanor Roosevelt goes down and she wants to see what this operation is all about. She walks up to Chief Anderson, who's the head of the training corps, and she said, I hear Negroes can't fly planes. Would you mind taking me up? And so Chief Anderson said, sure. But meanwhile, the Secret Service that were there said, no, we don't want you to do this. And they called up Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the President of the United States, and said, she's going to fly in this airplane. What do we do? And he says, hey, there's nothing we can do. You got to let her fly. And so she went up and flew with the Chief Anderson for about a half an hour and said, well, I guess you can fly. Went home, and about a day later, they set up a really good training program down there for African-American pilots.
With the help of First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, the Tuskegee Experiment received its funding, and the Tuskegee Army Airfield was in business. But the hardships and indignities the cadets would endure were many, sometimes even fatal.
My father was on a night training mission from Godwinfield, Kentucky to Tuskegee Army Airfield. However, they did not have enough high-octane fuel at Tuskegee Airfield, so he had to land at Gunner Airfield to refuel. They told the pilots not to land at Gunner, not black pilots. Bad things can happen there. Now, I don't know all the ins and outs of what happened. I read the accident report. They said they didn't follow procedures. Well, anybody can say that, but did that actually happen? Because shortly after takeoff, lost both engines. Lost both engines. It was airborne and crashed 2 miles at the end of the runway.
They just treated like you were just a lower class animal of some sort. You see a white person coming, if you're on the sidewalk, you have to get off, and it's just all kinds of things. And of course, the military, I didn't like the segregated services. All of our higher ranking officers were all white, and they weren't very nice.
The cadets were painfully aware that this was an experiment. Individual success meant success for all African Americans. If they crashed, all African Americans went down with them.
Can you imagine the pressure? Beyond just the normal pressure of being in the military unit and going through basic camp. I can, because I'm a military intelligence officer, former captain in the Army. So I know very well the anxiety associated with the challenges of basic training. But when you add on top of that, you're persona non grata, you're expected to perform under this deficit model of you're at risk of not being an effective pilot. You persevere, you excel beyond, and you do it with elegance and grace.
The Tuskegee Airmen did persevere through their training. Between 1942 and 1946, Tuskegee Army Airfield graduated 993 African American pilots. One of the first graduates of the Tuskegee was a West Point graduate, Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. Davis was selected as the commander of the 99th Squadron and the 332nd Fighter Group, and later became the U.S. Air Force's first African American general officer. Throughout the war, various attempts were made to discredit African American combat pilots. Their courage and skill, however, eventually earned them respect from those who first questioned their ability and doubted their courage. Dubbed the Red Tails because of the distinctive tail markings on their airplanes, they became known as experts in bomber escort and enjoyed the distinction of never losing a bomber they were escorting. No other group in the United States Armed Forces could make that claim. Despite the impressive battle records in the service of their country, African Americans continued to endure racism at home. African Americans in the military were said to be fighting two wars, one against the enemy in Europe and another against racism.
They're fighting for their country, a country that really doesn't even appreciate them that much, but they're willing to give their lives for it, and that just amazed me. I mean, you have been pushed to the side by a country, you're going to go out there and possibly give your life, and that's the most important thing to you at this point in time.
On the home front in the African American community, a campaign to illustrate their frustration was conceived. They called it the Double V.
It's not enough to have victory abroad. We must have victory at home. We must do something about all this discrimination at home. We must do something to equalize opportunities and so forth. So yes, a victory abroad, yes, but a victory at home also. That's the Double V.
In the end, the Tuskegee Airmen left no doubt in white America's mind that the Tuskegee experiment was indeed a stunning success. By war's end, an amazing 1,578 missions had been flown, with 865 commendations for bravery awarded. Their courage, their dignity, their grace under fire would pave the way for generations to follow.
The number one thing they did was just open the door. I mean, it's always hardest to be first. They lived through you can't do the job. There's something different about you because of the color of your skin, and you have no depth perception, you aren't willing to work hard. All that stuff went away. When they went out there and broke down those barriers, they absorbed all those spears, so I don't have to. The spears I absorb are much smaller. I am able to go out there and excel just based on the fact that they went out there and opened up this door so I could step through it.
These are the guys who put their life on the line. And they demonstrated that they're willing to do this even if they were victims of outrageous discrimination, that they were Americans. You know, that's something. And I think they should be remembered for what they did. And I think it would make the generations that followed a bit proud to say that, gee, I had grandparents who were gutsy like this.
Victory abroad? Yes. Victory at home? Soon after World War II, President Harry Truman integrated the armed forces, citing the bravery and unflinching patriotism of the African American men who fought and died for their country. Freedom Song was marching to a new tune, and more victories were to follow. As the second half of the 20th century began, Jim Crow, the legalized discrimination that had plagued the first half of the century, was beginning to show signs of becoming an endangered species. Wartime labor and post-war economic growth had opened new opportunities for blacks, which resulted in the desegregation of many workplaces. In 1946, President Harry Truman appointed a Committee on Civil Rights. The committee's report, entitled "To Secure These Rights," called for the elimination of segregation everywhere based on race, color, creed, or national origin. 2 years later, President Truman urged Congress to pass civil rights legislation and issued an executive order to eliminate segregation in federal employment and military venues. Truman also eliminated the segregation requirement for federal housing mortgage insurance. And the next president, Dwight D. Eisenhower, promised during his 1952 presidential campaign to end segregation. As Eisenhower took office, a battle was already underway to end segregation in our nation's schools. At the time, separate but equal was the standard. This notion, however, was about to be challenged in one of the most famous Supreme Court cases in American history, Brown versus Board of Education.
Brown versus Board of Education issued a proclamation saying separate is not equal, that African American children and white children can be assured education, but prior to Brown versus Board of Education, they were taught in different schools. So separate is not equal.
While buses were provided for African American children, they were only allowed to attend designated public schools based on race. In some cases, black children traveled miles on a bus to get to their school, while a perfectly good white public school was a short walk away. Traditionally, the black schools were not outfitted with the same equipment or learning materials. Oftentimes, black schools inherited the worn-out textbooks from the white schools, while the white students enjoyed crisp new copies.
I do remember the buses arriving with all the kids, including Linda Brown, getting off the bus about 10 to 15 minutes before school started. And they would play and wrestle and have a good time. And I didn't think about the disparity in education and what that represented constitutionally at the time.
The kids had to ride the school bus and get up and spend long hours and stand on the dark, cold corners when they could just walk a couple of blocks to their school.
Since the war ended in 1945, parents of these disenfranchised black children had begun a slow burn that began to catch fire as the new decade dawned. The first spark was ignited by one mother on a cold winter's afternoon, who watched her daughter almost get hit by a car getting off the bus.
Of course, my mother hated the fact that I had to ride the bus to school because we had a neighborhood school, you know, a couple of blocks away. So she met the school bus in the evening, and I was so excited because I saw her on the other side of the street, and I jumped off the bus and started across the street to meet her, and a car was coming. Almost got hit.
Lucinda Todd was no ordinary mother. She was a school teacher, educated at the State Teachers College in Pittsburgh, Kansas. She had already done battle with the local school board to bring the same music classes to her daughter's school that the white schools enjoyed. She knew how to get things done. She knew how to turn anger into action.
She was the secretary of the NAACP for Topeka, Kansas. Social activist fighting for social justice, not only for her child, Nancy Todd Nochez, but also for all children in the United States. When you look at the long-term effect of that activism.
My mother and Mr. Burnett, who was the president of the NAACP in Topeka, they really worked hard on the case. And they got Oliver Brown, who the case was named after, they asked him to be a plaintiff because his daughter had a really hard case. You know, she had to get up and go across the railroad tracks in the dark to catch her bus to ride clear across town when she could have gone to her neighborhood school.
As she had done to help bring music to the local black schools, she started with her local school board. But it soon became clear that this battle would require heavier artillery.
They presented those petitions to the school board, but it didn't do any good. So then they decided they needed to go to court.
In the end, the lawsuit was the combination of 5 cases from various parts of the country, representing nearly 200 plaintiffs. The flames of freedom, begun as a brush fire on the plains of Kansas, had spread all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court in the form of Brown versus Board of Education. Thurgood Marshall, who would go on to become the first African American on the Supreme Court, headed the legal team commissioned by the NAACP. He was well aware of how high the stakes were and how savvy the resistance would be. He used the famed Howard University as its base for operations, taking advantage of the best African American legal and historical scholars of the day. Historian Dr. John Hope Franklin was on the research team who helped Thurgood Marshall's lawyers develop their groundbreaking case.
Thurgood, who was my friend and with whom I had worked in the Lyman Johnson case back in Kentucky in 1948. So I worked with him all the summer and fall of 1953, helping him and his associates to answer the questions that had been given by the Supreme Court, such as the intent, what was the intent of the framers of the 14th Amendment with respect to school segregation. And in that way, they went into the Supreme Court to argue the case of Brown against the Board of Education with a kind of legal sophistication, historical sophistication, that they didn't have otherwise.
The months passed. The scholars labored to assemble their argument. The basic right to an equal education for the children of African Americans hung in the balance.
I doubt that many people thought they would ultimately be successful. But the reality is that they were able to make their legal arguments using the most fundamental document of American society, the United States Constitution.
Over 3 years had passed since that cold winter's morning when one mother had decided enough was enough. But finally, the decision came down from the Supreme Court on Brown versus Board of Education. May 17, 1954, is a day seared into the memory of all African Americans who were alive to witness it.
I couldn't believe it. Although it was wonderful music to my ears, I just couldn't imagine that, and that it was unanimous.
Well, we just thought that we had arrived. We thought that at last, now, we have achieved what we've been working for. It was a great day, and all through the community, everybody was rejoicing, and they were speaking about it as if it were a personal event. And it had a real meaning because it meant that you felt, now segregation is gone, now we are really on our road to freedom.
But the celebration would not last. For while a huge victory had been won and laws had been changed, enforcing those laws would be a different story.
We had so much respect for the law and for the institutions of our country that we thought that, well, the Supreme Court has spoken, that's it, you see. The Supreme Court has spoken, but the Southerners said this is not it.
Thurgood Marshall was just a brilliant mind who had the vision. He knew there would be further court battles. the Legal Defense Fund knew that there would be challenges in every Southern legislature. There would be challenges in Congress, because they were not challenging just a law, they were challenging a culture.
Across the country, battles continued to be fought for years to enforce the decision. The culture that was being challenged did not go down without a fight. But with Brown versus Board of Education, the law was now on the side of equality and justice. The wheels of change had been set in motion, and Freedom's song was on a roll.
When you hear the word rights, it all draws back to that little wisp of a action of one letter written by one lady, precious lady in Kansas, that started that entire process. And it exploded. It exploded into Martin Luther King, exploded into Nelson Mandela, exploded into Rosa Parks, because it provided the legal framework for what they were doing. There was no other act you can go back to where there's a continuous succession of legal cases that were built around the interpretation of the 14th Amendment and what that meant to human rights.
The battle to integrate our nation's schools, begun that January afternoon in 1951, would continue for decades. But eventually, Freedom's song would be heard by every child in every classroom across America.
In so many ways, we were all impacted by it, not just people of color, not just African Americans or Latinos or Asians and women, but all of us. America is a better place today because there was a Civil Rights Act, because there was a Brown versus Board of Education decision, because we pushed the country to be all that it's held itself out to be.
The 60s. No other decade in the 20th century evokes more images of civil unrest and protest in America. And alongside the war protests sweeping the college campuses and urban areas, the civil rights movement was at its apex, demanding change, demanding equality, and demanding it now. The most famous civil rights event of the 60s, and perhaps all time, took place in the summer of 1963. 250,000 people marched on Washington to hear Dr. Martin Luther King deliver his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. A few months later, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated, and the already restless decade got even more turbulent and confrontational. But by the mid-60s, the civil rights movement was starting to do more than make noise and garner headlines. It was beginning to produce some real results. The Civil Rights Act in 1964 and the Voting Rights Act in 1965, both groundbreaking legislation that illustrated beyond a shadow of a doubt that America was ready to get serious about freedoms that had been denied to African Americans for generations. With these successes under their belt, the civil rights movement broadened the scope of its mission.
There was a sense in America in the 1950s that poverty was not a substantial problem. And so after 1964 and 1965, with the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, many black leaders, especially Martin Luther King and members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, said, let's address the economic issues.
The Poor People's Campaign, conceived by Dr. Martin Luther King, was designed to bring people of all races together from all parts of the United States. This convergence of racial and economic concerns brought Black, Hispanic, American Indian, and white people together to make government officials more aware of those living in poverty. Vincent DeForest worked on the Poor People's Campaign.
This was a movement whereby all ethnicities would be involved. Dr. King had invited American Indian, for example, Hispanic Americans, Appalachian whites, blacks from various parts of the country. And this whole campaign was, the major issue was poverty in the United States. We were hoping to accomplish bringing the visibility of poverty, representing a diverse group of people throughout the United States that were out of sight, out of sound, bringing that attention to the general public in a way that we could address it both on a local level and a federal level.
I'd been a part of the civil rights movement, And when Dr. King first talked about the Poor People's Campaign, I understood that because even all during the Civil Rights Movement, what I found was that I was a part of the great men working together in the strategies.
The Poor People's Campaign set out to be the most expansive and elaborate nonviolent protest in American history. Representatives from all over the United States converged on the nation's capital to lobby Congress and other governmental agencies for an economic Bill of Rights. But this was not to be your ordinary protest or civil rights march. From May 14th to June 24th, 1968, over 2,600 people would erect an actual city on Washington, D.C.'s famous mall and live there.
You can visualize a city on the mall, one side of the mall. You know, there's a reflecting pool in the center, and then there are two stretches of landmass on either side, extending all the way from the Washington Monument all the way just about to where the World War II monument is today. John Wiebenson was the architect for the physical development of the city. He created a simple structure, A-frame structure, out of plywood, where there wouldn't be a lot of cutting that could be prefabbed in another location and brought on site. Each of the A-frame structures was approximately 8 feet long, triangular, with wooden 2x4 framing, and each one of them unique, expressing sentiments from those who were staying there.
The makeshift town was dubbed Resurrection City. It included a city hall, a dispensary, a dining tent, a poor people's university, a cultural tent called the Soul Center, a psychiatrist, and even its own zip code.
The largest building in Resurrection City was City Hall. And City Hall was approximately 32 feet long, 12 feet high, and 12 feet wide. And one side of the wall was completely solid. And it was decided that that would be called the Hunger Wall. And this gave each individual who had something to say a space where they could write whatever or draw or do whatever they wanted on this wall.
But the main focus of the campaign was not the physical structure, but rather the caravans of people who had traveled across the country to attend. For the first time, side by side, African Americans were joining forces with other minorities, Hispanics, Asians, and Native Americans. They were coming together because they all shared the same reality: poverty.
Here we had a movement, which I think is probably the first time in American history, where in one movement you had the diversity that was represented by the Poor People's Campaign in terms of the ethnic groups, all of these groups coming together for the first time with a massive movement, and maybe the first time ever working with each other in concert to bring about this awareness, this transitional awakening. And as a result of that, I think every group learned something about each other that they didn't know before.
To set the tone of solidarity with their fellow minorities, a ceremony took place to inaugurate the city.
There was a formal ceremony where the American Indian gave us the right to build Resurrection City in that spot, which I thought was a very appropriate thing to happen. And it historically informed a lot of people that the land of the nation's capital was at one time owned by the American Indian.
Throughout the month-long stay, occupants of Resurrection City were provided musical entertainment, cultural exchange programs, and multiracial education courses, all of which were focused on racial tensions. The prefab city sent a message to the politicians to focus attention on the poor and start enacting legislation to help those living in poverty.
People were saying, please help us not be poor. Give us equal pay for equal work. Give us the rights that other people have. And it struck me that it's very similar to what we're going through now. We still have poverty. And it's not race related always. We have white people that are poor, we have Hispanic people that are poor, and yet we're still struggling with all those same issues.
The Poor People's Campaign culminated on June 19, 1968, with Solidarity Day. On this day, 50,000 people marched to the Lincoln Memorial to peacefully discuss issues relating to the goals of the campaign. 5 days later, on June 24th, Resurrection City was dismantled.
I don't remember the exact number of days, but it was close to a month. And I would say that out of a 30-day period, that it must have rained. It felt like it rained 29 of the 30 days.
Dr. Martin Luther King, who conceived the plan for the Poor People's Campaign, did not survive to see its fruition. 2 months earlier, on April 4, 1968, he had been assassinated while in Memphis defending the rights of striking sanitation workers. But his dream of bringing poverty to the attention of the federal government in Washington in the form of Resurrection City had become a reality.
The Poor People's Campaign is an important part of American history that's been forgotten, and it should not be forgotten, because this was a moment in American history, and these moments are exceedingly rare when activists and politicians focus their attention on poverty in America.
History has a way of repeating itself. And I think that to almost all of the newscasts that I've heard after Katrina, this is the first time in a long time since the Poor People's Campaign that I have seen that much focus given to the issue of poverty. And I think that it is good if we do something about it.
The Poor People's Campaign helped lend support to President Lyndon Johnson's declared war on poverty and to establish valuable programs that would help the poor in America. Medicaid, Job Corps, Head Start, Chapter 1 reading programs in schools, school lunch programs, and guaranteed student loan programs. All of these were enacted after the Poor People's Campaign. With the Poor People's Campaign, it became apparent that Freedom's song had resonance far beyond the African American community. It reminded us that living in poverty is living without freedom. And when some of us are not free, none of us are truly free. In the 60s, Freedom's song had been heard loud and clear by those who held positions of power in American government. In the 70s, African Americans would begin the process of becoming those people in power. Since the end of the 50s, many northern cities had been experiencing what became known as white flight, an exodus of the white population from the cities to the newly developed suburbs. This presented an economic and social crisis in many large urban areas across the country. A dwindling tax base, an increase in violent crime, diminishing federal support for social programs. All of these resulted, in part, from the white population relocating to the greener pastures of suburbia. But this exodus provided something else, an opportunity for African Americans to maneuver themselves into positions of power, to take the helm of these beleaguered urban areas. Like the Tuskegee Airmen had in World War II, they could prove that they had the courage and the talent to get the job done.
Initially, the black politicians were faced with many issues that made it difficult. There was a lower tax base, there was economic hardship in the inner cities, there was white flight, which also affected the tax base, there was violence. They had to wrestle with all of these issues, so they had enormous problems. They overcame those. They persevered, and in most cases made their cities better places to live.
In 1968, Richard Hatcher was mayor of Gary, Indiana. He was one of 2 African American mayors in America, the other being Carl Stokes in Cleveland, Ohio. 4 years after taking office, Mayor Hatcher helped organize the National Black Political Convention in his hometown. On March 10th through the 12th, 1972, several thousand African Americans converged on West Side High School in Gary, Indiana, for the National Black Political Convention. The convention pulled together a cross-section of people representing a wide range of political philosophies. Republicans, Democrats, nationalists, socialists, and independents all came to address an ambitious agenda.
It was a convention that brought together all aspects, all segments of the black community to deal with the issues of African Americans in America. I don't think there was a political leader any place in the country that was black that wasn't there at that convention. You have people like Maynard Jackson, Jesse Jackson, and all the elected mayors at the time were there at that convention. And the objective was to develop a political agenda for African Americans. In fact, they toyed with even developing an African American political party. That never transpired.
What emerged from the conference was a motivated political force, spurred on by the belief that their time had come. African Americans would begin an aggressive assault to attain the power that had been denied them for so long. And the urban sprawls that in many cases had fallen into decay were the logical place to mount their offensive. One by one, victories were made. Elected mayor of Atlanta, Georgia, the very next year in 1973, Maynard Jackson was the first African American to serve as mayor of a major southern city. Jackson served 8 years and then returned for a third term in 1990.
He had to really energize his base to get out and vote. He had to get support from people who, being in a southern city like Atlanta, would not normally vote for an African American. He had a sound educational foundation, had gone to Morehouse, one of the historical black colleges there in Atlanta, and went on and graduated very young, I think a teenager, went on and got a law degree.
During his 3 terms as mayor, Jackson lowered the crime rate in Atlanta, assisted with the crucial expansion of Hartsfield International Airport, helped the city start its rapid rail system, successfully orchestrated bringing the 1996 Olympics to Atlanta, and streamlined the city's administration structure.
I had worked for Maynard Jackson for 4 years. I watched him do some remarkable things there. Very intelligent person, very, very bright, very articulate, and as a result, he was able to get things done as the first African-American mayor in Atlanta, Georgia, first mayor of any major city in the South, and that was very significant. He, in my estimation, is really the father of affirmative action in America because he believed in it, he insisted that the job get done, and it did get done because of his perseverance.
That same year, across America on the other coast, another African American was also making history. The son of sharecroppers and the grandson of a slave, Tom Bradley first ran for mayor of Los Angeles in 1969, challenging the conservative incumbent, Sam Yorty. Bradley finished first in the primary, but lost in the general election after a bitter campaign in which Yorty portrayed him as a black militant and ultra-leftist. Undeterred, Bradley opposed Yorty again in 1973, this time successfully, having built a powerful citywide racial, religious, and ethnic coalition. He won re-election an unprecedented 4 more times before retiring in 1993.
Well, he's LA's greatest mayor. He was a man who will stand tall above the others. He was a coalition builder. He was someone who brought Latinos and Jews and African Americans together, a man of results.
Bradley presided over a period of enormous growth, leaving a gleaming downtown skyline and the start of a subway and light rail system as the most tangible of his legacies. He was also key to the racial peace that the rapidly diversifying city enjoyed during most of his 5-term hold on the mayor's office. He opened doors for minorities and women to serve on city commissions and advance in the employment ranks at City Hall and share in city contracts. He positioned the emerging metropolis to take its place as an international trade center, and a dozen years before Maynard Jackson did it in Atlanta, brought the city a glowing spot on the world stage with the Olympic Games in 1984.
Mayor Bradley was a people's mayor. He just seemed to care about people. It didn't matter if you were African American or Asian or Hispanic or Anglo-American. He just cared about people. And I believe his interest was genuine. I believe he wanted people to succeed. He cared very deeply for the city of Los Angeles and wanted this to become a very great place to live. And I believe he achieved a lot of those goals in the 20 years that he was the leader of the city.
As the decade progressed, more and more mayoral elections were won by African Americans. By the end of the 70s, African American mayoral victories were scattered throughout the entire urban landscape of America. In one major American city, however, victory remained elusive. Chicago was a city infamous for its racial tension. In 1966, during a march in Chicago to draw attention to the open housing issue, Martin Luther King had been stoned by an angry mob. But in the end, even Chicago arrived at a moment that it could no longer turn a deaf ear to freedom's song.
Now, back in Chicago, there were all kinds of rumors that Harold Washington might be running for mayor. But none of those rumors had been verified. And so I said, Congressman, word on the street is that you're going to run for mayor. Is that correct? And he just laughed. And sure enough, he ran for mayor.
Harold Washington, U.S. Congressman from the 1st District in Illinois, announced his candidacy on November 10, 1982. He wasn't expected to win. The black mayoral candidate never won in Chicago. But this mayoral primary was different. Incumbent Mayor Jane Byrne was pitted against her arch-rival and heir apparent to the Chicago Democratic political machine, Richard M. Daley, the son of the former 5-term mayor. Washington edged out both Mayor Byrne and Richard M. Daley by winning the Democratic primary with 36% of the vote. He would face Republican Bernard Epton in the general election. Normally, it would have been no contest. The Republican mayoral candidate never won in Chicago. But like the primary, this election was different. The Republican candidate moved quickly to capitalize on the race issue. His campaign slogan became, "Epton, before it's too late." The rumor was that even the Democratic precinct captains and loyalists to the Daley political machine were secretly encouraging voters to cross party lines and vote for the Republican. But on Election Day, the city of Big Shoulders proved that it was indeed ready to embrace an African American as mayor. Washington won the general election on April 12, 1983, with 52% of the vote, defeating Republican Bernard Epton.
I will never forget the night that he won and the celebration that occurred. I believe it was at McCormick Place. A lot of people were happy that night, and it was a good beginning. And I believe that Mayor Washington, he did an outstanding job, and I do believe that he continued to open up the door for the election of big city mayors.
It was powerful, certainly for African Americans, to see one of their own speaking and holding their own in a context where they weren't used to seeing people like themselves exhibiting a sense of power. And I think it was also enlightening for the white community to see people who were articulate and thoughtful and powerful speakers speak to the same issues and topics that concern them.
The number of African American mayors grew from 2 in 1968 to 48 in 1973, to 316 in 1990, and to 531 in 2004. At one time or another, black mayors were elected to every one of the largest cities in the U.S., from New York to Los Angeles to Atlanta to Seattle. And what these trailblazers accomplished stretched far beyond the realm of the African American community.
The interesting thing about looking historically at the black mayors, not only did they open up the political process for blacks, but they opened up the process for other minorities to take charge and become politically active.
I've said when talking about my journey to City Hall that I grew up in City Terrace, a short distance from City Hall, but we all know what a truly vast distance it is. We had to overcome many obstacles to get here, and I can tell you that if there hadn't been a Tom Bradley, that journey would have been more difficult.
You have to have coalition politics. You have to involve all the people because you're going to represent all the people. But you can't overlook the fact of race. Race is still very relevant in America. I think if you're looking at one thing that's consistent, all of the African American mayors have attained a good education. And that includes myself. I went to college for 15 years and I'm not a slow learner. During those 15 years, I got a bachelor's degree, 2 master's degrees, and a doctor's degree. And I attribute that as the key to my success. In fact, I believe very strongly that the key to success in America is education.
Freedom's song now echoed through city halls across the land. The 70s had witnessed African Americans taking great political strides at a local level, and it would lay the groundwork for what would happen in the next decade, when Freedom's song would be heard all the way to the race for the highest office in the land. The 70s witnessed great strides for African Americans in local politics. Coast to coast, voters had entrusted black men with the keys to their city, electing African Americans their mayor. It begged the question, what next? Ironically, it was an African American's successful run for mayor of Chicago in 1983 that would prove to be a rallying call for the first serious run by an African American for a considerably higher office.
And it really started in a lot of ways over the 2 major Democratic contenders for president that year deciding to get involved in the mayoral race in Chicago. The Kennedy organization got behind one candidate, and the Mondale organization got behind another candidate. And a number of national African American leaders were incensed that the Democratic establishment, so to speak, the progressive, liberal establishment of the Democratic Party in particular, would decide to go against a respected African-American member of the United States Congress, Harold Washington, who was running for mayor. And that, in a lot of ways, began discussions about maybe to get the respect that African-Americans ought to get, somebody ought to run for president.
After the Chicago mayoral election in April 1983, the African-American political leadership began a series of secret meetings across the country. Their purpose was to discuss what would be the most effective way to let the Democratic Party leadership know that African Americans could not be taken for granted.
There were meetings in Atlanta, in Washington, in Chicago, and these were meetings that were secretive meetings. And Julian Bond was there, Andrew Young, Maynard Jackson. All of the national players on the scene were around and involved in saying how important it was for us to have a viable chance to have someone from the black community become mayor of Chicago.
It was decided that the best way to show the 2 frontrunners for the 1984 Democratic presidential nomination that the black community was a political force to be reckoned with was to give them a run for their money. A black man would run for the President of the United States, challenge the established norm, and change the landscape of presidential politics forever.
I'm not sure that Reverend Jackson at that time thought he'd be the candidate. There were discussions about whether or not Maynard Jackson or Andrew Young or someone else should run. Of course, nobody was really stepping up to the plate.
I tried to get Andy Young to run. So he chose not to. He just left the UN. I tried to get Maynard Jackson to run. I think he had the requisite background. And he had been in corporate America for a while, so he wanted to stabilize his family financially. He didn't do it. So I said, somebody needs to do it.
Jesse Jackson was born on October 8, 1941, to a 17-year-old unwed high school student and her older middle-class neighbor, a married man. Jackson's ancestry included black slaves, a Cherokee, even a white plantation owner. Nurtured by his loving mother, grandmother, and stepfather, he grew up poor in a still segregated South.
I was born in Greenville, South Carolina during the Second World War. We lived under extreme conditions of racial segregation. It was illegal for a person of color to use a public hotel or motel or park or library unless the sign said colored and white. I never saw a black policeman or a black fireman through my entire childhood. Our schools were all segregated by race. And so race was the defining feature. We learned to survive within the context of our situation. We learned to survive.
From an early age, Jackson did more than survive. He excelled. In 1959, Jackson left the South to attend the University of Illinois on an athletic scholarship. During his first year, however, he became dissatisfied with his treatment on campus and on the gridiron, and decided to transfer to Greensboro's North Carolina Agricultural and Technical College, a predominantly black institution. There he was quarterback, honor student, fraternity officer, and president of the student body. After receiving his BA in sociology, he accepted a Rockefeller grant to attend the Chicago Theological Seminary, where he planned to train for the ministry. Jackson was ordained a Baptist minister in 1968, though he had not finished his coursework at CTS, having instead left in 1966 to commit full-time to the civil rights movement. His mentor was Dr. Martin Luther King.
I joined Dr. King's staff after Selma in 1965. I was with him until he was killed. I was in conversation with him when he was killed in 1968 in Memphis, Tennessee. It was a cold, bloody murder. So it was a very painful period for us. And yet, we were duty-bound to keep going, to keep fighting, to keep going forward.
After Dr. Martin Luther King's assassination in 1968, Jackson left the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to found Operation PUSH, People United to Save Humanity. Through PUSH, Jackson carried on the work of Dr. King by attacking the afflictions of the poor and powerless in America. And now, in 1983, 15 years after he held his dying mentor in his arms, Jesse Jackson was about to take Dr. Martin Luther King's dream into the race for the highest office in the land.
At some point, we were doing a Southern voter registration drive. And debate, should a black run, should a black not run, kind of ensued, because it was kind of novel at the time. Someplace down the road, someone said, "Run, Jesse, run," and it just got louder and louder.
I remember "Run, Jesse, run." I do. And was so proud that finally an African American that appeared that could win was running for president.
Jackson had never run for public office, much less the President of the United States. Organizing a nationwide campaign proved to be a daunting task.
I had no preparations for a campaign. I really had no idea of how to put such a campaign together. Like, we had to go forward. Boy, and here we came with this whole new dynamic.
He clearly started out with a base, that base being the black community. But I think that he built on the dream that Martin Luther King had. Towards the end of Martin Luther King's life, what he was trying to do was broaden that base to a real poor people's campaign, people who were locked out of the process regardless of what color they were.
Jackson's idea of a rainbow coalition struck a chord with people of all colors who had been left behind by the establishment candidates. And his campaign reflected his unique message.
We went to Native American reservations, stayed on the reservations to give them a sense that they were a part of something. We went to barrios, we went to Appalachian whites, we stayed in the mountains, we stayed in people's homes. We took our campaign to people's houses, to their blocks, to their streets to make them come alive. And in some sense, that was part of our mission, was to build a coalition of interests where people had some things in common.
But when Jesse ran, he went to places that people didn't expect him to go. He went and spoke to farmers in Iowa and other poor and disenfranchised people that weren't always African American, and really made white America realize that we had more in common, particularly when we didn't have the resources, that was different.
I first got involved in the 1984 Jackson campaign for president. I was inspired by him, inspired by his rhetoric, inspired by his values, and by the hope that he instilled in us for a better future.
We kind of knew the issues that had to be raised. We knew the issue of a free South Africa had to be raised at that time. We knew we had to fight the influx of guns and drugs into urban America, and there'd be some urban policy to reinvest in America. So we kind of staked out some territory. But we also inspired people's imagination.
Jackson's appeals for social programs, voting rights, and affirmative action for those neglected by the status quo earned him strong showings in Alabama, Florida, Georgia, New York, Louisiana, and Washington, D.C. His voting registration drive logged in an estimated 2 million new voters. In the end, he received 3.5 million votes, enough to secure a measure of power and respect at the Democratic Convention.
2 million new registered voters. And the impact of that was dramatic.
And it was an exciting campaign for many. And I remember, I believe that was my very first Democratic convention. I remember the excitement that was there in the halls of the convention, in part due to his candidacy.
The campaign catapulted into a crescendo that nobody ever dreamed about. I suspect that even people who were very much a part of Reverend Jackson's inner circle were surprised at just how well he did.
Jesse Jackson had made history. 12 years earlier, African-American Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm had run for president, but she hadn't won any primaries. In 1984, Jackson had won 5. He had demonstrated to a skeptical America that yes, it could be done. But some people thought that his run and success was a one-time event. After all, in 1984, the very popular Ronald Reagan was running for his second term. In the general election, Reagan destroyed the Democratic nominee, Walter Mondale, by winning every single state except Mondale's home state of Minnesota. In 1988, the thinking went, things would be different. People would be taking this election more seriously. And that proved to be good news for Jesse Jackson. He ran again, and this time, he didn't surprise the political naysayers. He astonished them.
By 88, Reverend Jackson had expanded that rainbow into a much more colorful array of political support than anybody dreamed of. He did very well in the Hispanic community. He pulled together a real poor people's campaign. I mean, he had folks from Appalachia, anybody who could relate to being the underdog and having a chance to be a part of the mainstream ended up getting on Reverend Jackson's program. The environmentalists, all those folks who needed a voice for their issues, they had one in him.
Jackson's 1988 campaign for the Democratic nomination built on the successes of his first run with more organization and more funding. Now a seasoned candidate, Jackson and his Rainbow Coalition swung into action with an aggressive, well-oiled campaign that would prove to the media and the political pundits that Jesse Jackson was indeed a serious contender for the nomination. After early respectable losses in Iowa and New Hampshire, he won 5 southern states on Super Tuesday, March 8, 1988. On March 12th, he won in his birth state of South Carolina, and 3 days later, finished second in his home state of Illinois. But on March 26th, Jackson stunned Dukakis and the rest of the nation in Michigan. He won that northern industrial state with an impressive 55% of the vote, and with that, Jackson, an African-American descendant of slaves, became the frontrunner for the Democratic nomination for the President of the United States.
It really was a galvanizing point in American politics. A tremendous number of young people around the country who worked in that campaign ended up holding political positions.
Well, I think he surprised the nation. I wasn't as surprised. I was working on that campaign, and I was because I believed in him, and I thought his message was one of hopefulness and one of inspiring us to do more for one another.
And I think that whether he won or lost, in a sense he won. And he also set a new pace for those who are African American to become candidates. When we started a few years ago, there were 3 African American congresspeople. Now we have 40.
Our campaign served as a connection point, and people began to emerge in all these dimensions for the reservations, the barrios, Appalachia. And to me, that is the great lasting joy of the campaign. We were able to arouse a new coalition of conscience.
The 20th century had begun with lynchings and Jim Crow laws. And now, as it prepared to enter its final decade, an African American had achieved the unthinkable. He had run for and had come close to winning the highest office in the land. Freedom's song would never be the same. The first 90 years of the 20th century had seen changes in the African American way of life that, even in retrospect, are almost impossible to comprehend. From a nation that at the turn of the century had condoned segregation, discrimination, and the denial of basic civil rights, that had looked the other way when it came to lynchings, beatings, and other terrorist activities perpetrated on the black community, America had become a land where African Americans were living, learning, and working side by side with white Americans, enjoying the same rights, going to the same restaurants, drinking from the same water fountains, and even running for the President of the United States. Black Americans, indeed all Americans, had reason to feel proud of the obstacles they had overcome and the progress they had made together as the last decade of the 20th century began. Still, things were far from perfect. On the surface, Freedom's song had rung out loud and clear across America, eliminating the Jim Crow laws and enacting other laws that ensured the civil rights guaranteed under the Constitution. Underneath the surface, other challenges loomed. Other demons lingered.
During the late 1980s and early 1990s, the community was plagued by drugs and violence. The crack cocaine trade had spread so rapidly that in many communities, a lot of people were afraid to come together because of the violence, because you didn't know what to expect from other black people during this period.
Desperation simmered within the inner city neighborhoods, sometimes boiling over into violence. On April 29, 1992, 12 jurors in California rendered their verdicts in a controversial case involving the 1991 beating of Rodney King by 4 LAPD officers. One of the officers was found guilty of excessive force. The other officers were cleared of all charges. As the verdicts were broadcast live, the word spread quickly throughout Los Angeles. People began rioting. For the next 3 days, the violence and mayhem continued. The final tally of the destruction was devastating. More than 50 killed, over 4,000 injured, 12,000 arrested, and $1 billion in property damage. Almost all of the damage had occurred in and around the African American community. Halfway through the decade, however, amid the distrust and turmoil, there was one magnificent moment of peace and tranquility. On October 16, 1995, over 1 million black men stood peacefully on the Mall, on the west side of the U.S. Capitol in Washington, D.C. And with millions more watching television across the country and around the world, raised their hands and took a pledge to improve their lives and the lives of their wives, children, and families. This, the largest single gathering of African Americans in the history of the United States, was dubbed the Million Man March.
I was wondering, as a good historian and someone interested in the social sciences, whether the march would be successful. Anyone who wants to organize bringing 1 million people to the nation's capital is really undertaking something that's probably impossible to pull off. Through our history, people have marched on Washington, and even the March on Washington in 1964, 250,000 people. So I thought there was great hyperbole in the idea of a million-man march, and I thought that the name of the march itself would create all kinds of expectations that could not be fulfilled.
The march was conceived and organized by the Nation of Islam's Louis Farrakhan. The mere mention of his name conjured up controversy in the minds of some.
Farrakhan had been claimed to be anti-Semitic by many. Within the black community, most African Americans are not Muslims, and certainly not black Muslims.
In addition to the Farrakhan issue, there was the very name itself, Million Man March. The event was inviting the men of the African American community, not the women.
One of the important questions involved in the march was that it was 1 million men, not 1 million African Americans. The march itself represented something that was retrograde in the sense that it excluded women.
A lot of people at first said, well, you know, the black woman's being excluded. No, she wasn't being excluded. She was very much a part of it, but her job was to get the man together to go. And a lot of women, when they understood that, I mean, they shoved that man on the bus. You need to go.
Despite any reservations they might have had, in the end, hundreds of thousands of African American men from all over the country decided to embrace the idea and make the journey to Washington to show their support. And their reasons for coming were varied.
I felt I needed to go to the Million Man March because I've always been involved in neighborhood activity and uplifting my neighborhood. So I felt that it was important, since it was a day of atonement and reconciliation, that I should be there to get the message to take back to my neighborhood.
I'm a member of the Nation of Islam, and both my sons are in the Nation of Islam as well. So both my young teenage sons were there with me. Now, I would like to think that even if I wasn't in the Nation of Islam, I would be there, because it wasn't just people from the nation that was there. We were only a small percentage of it, really.
I decided that I was going to go to the Million Man March, but on my own terms. The march was supposed to be a gathering of men. I disagreed with that. I talked to my wife and asked her, did she want to go? And not only did she say she wanted to go, she said, we should bring the kids. And so my 12-year-old son and my 2-year-old daughter and my wife and I, we got in the car and we drove to Washington, and there we stood in a sea of black men, and here we were as a family unit.
The hopes of the organizers were high, but so were the fears of some who thought violence might occur. Many congressmen, senators, and other government officials left town for fear of being trapped in the throes of another riot, like the one that happened 3 years earlier in Los Angeles.
A lot of people couldn't understand why I would want to go to D.C. on a day when 1 million African American men were supposed to assemble. They thought it was going to be mass confusion and chaos. And I didn't feel that way. It turned out to be totally the opposite of what people expected.
A lot of black people get together, usually there's some problems. There was not one arrest. The weather was perfect. Everything was just right.
When the morning of October 16, 1995 dawned, it quickly became apparent that not only would there be no violence, but what everyone in attendance would experience would be of historic import. It would touch their hearts and souls and remain with them forever.
I remember the morning of the Million Man March. I left a friend of mine's house who I stayed over in D.C. that night. We got on at the Rhode Island Metro stop, and it was crowded. And I thought there would be shoving and pushing and, you know, just mass confusion, but it was very orderly, it was very quiet, it was a real warm feeling. Everybody I met was hugging me and shaking my hand and telling me their name and where they were from and hope to see you at the march. And it was just a very, very warm feeling that morning and throughout the day.
And one of the most marvelous things about it is that as we moved through the crowds, and there looked to be 1 million people, no one said anything. No one complained about the fact that this was for men only. No one raised the issue that not only it's for men, no one said bring your wife, but you're bringing your kids. And so we had a stroller and we moved through the crowds.
I heard this eerie silence where you could just hear everybody's footsteps, no talking. I mean, there were points during the course of the march that day that's all you heard were people's footsteps. And other than the speeches, it was just like everybody was in utter amazement of what was going on. I know it was awesome to me because I just kept looking around. I'm like, there are 1 million black men here, and I'm in the middle of all this, and it was just awesome.
No arrests, nobody fighting, no dope smoking, no drinking.
So at once I was the historian looking at this event, recognizing just how important it was, recognizing that, gee, how do you amass 1 million people in one place, and just stunned by the fact that it had happened, and then at the same time saying that I'm part of history. And so it was a very important part in my personal history, and of course, a very important part of African American history.
We just saw unity, we saw love for each other, we saw perfection on that day.
For 14 hours, an estimated 1 million African American men stood quietly together, side by side. They listened to the speeches, enjoyed the entertainment, and shared a day of solidarity that was unprecedented in American history.
1 million African Americans had gathered in one place, and it was a substantial percentage of the entire African American male population. Nothing like that has happened before. It would be the equivalent for American society as a whole for 30 million Americans to gather in Washington, D.C. out of the 300 million Americans. And so this is how phenomenal it was.
The day ended with a pledge that Louis Farrakhan asked everyone to recite with him. The words were simple and straightforward. I will strive to love my brother as I love myself. I will strive to build businesses, build houses, build hospitals, build factories. I will never raise my hand with a knife or a gun to beat, cut, or shoot any member of my family or any human being except in self-defense. I will never abuse my wife by striking her, disrespecting her. I will not poison my body with drugs. Simple words that struck a chord with African American men who were each struggling in their own way to make the most of those freedoms that had been forged in city streets and country backroads, the city halls and county courtrooms across America by the civil rights movement of the 20th century.
Some people were trying to write off the march because of Louis Farrakhan, who was the leader of the march. But he had a pledge, he had them recite the pledge, and then he said, I want you to turn to your brother and hug your brother. And that was the ending. And to embrace your brother. That's powerful.
I definitely got the message to go back and reconcile with the community and help uplift others.
What the Million Man March turned out to be was an educational process where we were able to demonstrate as a group of people that we do have the ability to influence the United States. We do have the ability to be good husbands. We do have the ability to serve our community in the capacity that we should.
The goal for the Million Man March was to empower black men to go back into their communities and be responsible citizens in their communities, to make their communities a better place, to not have black on black violence, to overcome that, to treat black women with respect. A consequence of the march was also there was a huge number of small businesses started by black men, and they became very successful, and they were in their communities. That was after they came back from the march.
On the 10th anniversary of the Million Man March, African Americans once again converged on the nation's capital to take part in the Million More movement. This time, not just men, but women and children were invited. Entire families traveled from all across America to unite in peace and solidarity and add their voices once more to freedom's song.
When there's darkness all around us and salvation seems so far, there is still a light inside us to remind us who we are, and it's always there to guide us, just like a shining star. Freedom song, freedom song. We walk the road together as we sing our freedom song. Now the road I'm on is rugged, but it doesn't bother me, 'cause the path I choose to follow leads me to a land that's free, and I won't forget the ones who cleared the way ahead of me. Freedom song, freedom song. We walk the road together as we sing our freedom song, freedom song, freedom song. We walk the road together as we sing our freedom song.
A. Philip Randolph, labor leader, was born in 1889 in Florida. In 1925, he organized the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. From that position of power, he was influential in the formation of the Fair Employment Practices Committee. During World War II, he fought discrimination in the defense industries and in the armed forces. In 1955, he became a member of the AFL-CIO Executive Council, the largest labor union in the country. Randolph's passion and dedication helped inspire a generation of black labor leaders. A. Philip Randolph is someone you should know.